Ethan Walker pushed open the conference room door and found a tense crowd of executives glaring at one another. A legal advisor gestured at a folder stuffed with eviction notices. The plan was simple: clear out tenants, expand the building, inflate profits. Ethan's head pounded with conflicting thoughts. Moments before, security guards had forcibly escorted a woman from the lobby for handing out flyers protesting these evictions. She pleaded for mercy, claiming her family had nowhere to go. Now that same drama continued behind closed doors. A marketing chief advocated swift action, promising lower costs if they removed every occupant within a week. Others eyed Ethan, waiting for him to sign the final authorization. The tension rose when someone slammed a document on the table, revealing pictures of families living on the property. The images showed battered walls, broken windows, and children in cramped rooms. Most directors waved off the pictures, calling them unfortunate but inevitable casualties of expansion. Ethan remained silent, trying not to let his apprehension show. No one else seemed bothered by the moral dilemma. Profits overshadowed everything. He examined the eviction list and recognized a name. It was an elderly woman who had once baked cookies for the security staff at his corporate tower. She faced forced removal too. Another name belonged to a single father whose kids waited outside local supermarkets, hoping to sell small crafts to buy groceries. Ethan shuffled the pages, hearing the lead attorney reaffirm the legal viability of immediate eviction. According to the plan, they'd sweep the building at dawn, push families out and board up every door. As the group pressed him for a signature, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw a news alert about a recent homeless shelter closure caused by lack of funding. The irony felt like a slap. He pictured the faces from the folder, reminded of the pleas from the woman downstairs. Guilt flared. Without a word, he stood. The executives huffed in annoyance, but he walked out, ignoring their shouts. Outside the conference room, his assistant, Marcus, tried to catch his attention. Ethan brushed him off, advanced to the private elevator, and descended to the lobby. There he spotted the flyers left on the floor. The woman's protest called for humane treatment and a plea for recognition. Some building employees stepped around the scattered papers, not wanting to pick them up. Ethan leaned down, grabbed a handful, and read a line. "Where will they go after this building shuts its doors on them?" He stuffed the flyers into his suit pocket and headed outside. A crowd remained in front of the skyscraper, carrying homemade signs. Most messages criticized corporate greed. They noticed Ethan stepping out and fell silent. He felt their eyes on him. A protester asked if he was proud of forcing families onto the streets. Ethan said nothing. He retreated to his car and sank into the back seat. Confusion filled his mind as the driver navigated crowded streets. He remembered a moment from years ago when he'd spoken at a charity gala and championed the need to help the less fortunate. Yet here he was, minutes away from displacing families. When he returned to his penthouse, he tossed his jacket onto a chair and looked around the sprawling living room. The place was silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. In the distance, the building at the center of the eviction crisis stood, small and insignificant from this perspective. He picked up a remote to switch on the TV. News channels highlighted the protest and speculated about how the eviction would unfold. A reporter mentioned how many homeless people roamed the streets each winter, how shelters were full, how children were left vulnerable. Ethan pressed the power button and the screen went dark. Later, he paced around an elegant kitchen, replaying the board meeting in his mind. Something gnawed at him. He recalled signing big deals in the past, but none had left him this uneasy. He remembered his father's words about the responsibility that came with wealth. Times had changed, he told himself, but the guilt remained. For a second, he considered discarding the entire plan, but the corporation demanded results. Clients expected expansions and large returns. Boards needed reassuring. Investors wanted bigger profit margins. Morality had no place in the forecasts. Marcus phoned, inquiring whether to proceed with the eviction timetable. Ethan paused before responding. He told Marcus to delay everything for 2 weeks and not to share the reasons. Marcus asked for an explanation. Ethan said he needed time to think. He hung up and gazed around at his pristine surroundings, recalling the battered walls and broken windows. He felt strangely trapped in a prison of glass and steel. The tension from earlier lingered, lodging itself in his chest. He headed to his study and found a note he'd scribbled months back. What if I saw it for myself? It referenced an old idea he once dismissed as naive. Now that concept felt urgent. He decided to test an idea that might help him understand the harsh reality faced by those losing their homes. He'd slip away from his corporate life and live on the streets, disguised with no resources. He needed to see if his wealth could ever address the root problem. He concluded that the only way to solve the puzzle was to experience it directly. He reached for his laptop and typed a quick message to the CFO, announcing a personal leave. He assigned Marcus to manage basic operations. Closing the lid, he reflected on the final words of the email, which promised a swift return. But he didn't know how long this plan would really take. Grabbing a simple sweatshirt and faded jeans he hadn't worn in years, he stuffed them into a duffel bag. He found an old sleeping bag from a long-ago camping trip, tossed it atop the clothes, and shut the bag. He left the penthouse without telling security, slipping past the lobby's polished floors and stepping onto the noisy sidewalk. For a moment, he stared back at the towering structure that bore his name. Then he turned away, uncertain of what he'd face next. His mind flashed with images of the eviction notices, the battered building, and the families on that list. He decided he wouldn't return until he understood what desperation really looked like. No more blind decisions about other people's struggles. He took a deep breath and moved forward. Ethan walked down the dimly lit streets of Lower Manhattan, with a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Each step pulled him further from his life of polished boardrooms and curated success. He had no driver tonight, no security detail tailing him, no Marcus ensuring his schedule flowed smoothly. For the first time in years, he was alone, completely, undeniably alone. He took a sharp turn and entered a side alley, crouching next to a rusted dumpster. Carefully, he changed out of his expensive tailored suit and into a threadbare sweatshirt and jeans. The clothes hung loose on him, a clear disconnect from his usual immaculate style. He stuffed his expensive shoes into the bag, swapping them for worn sneakers he'd found at the bottom of his closet. When he zipped the duffel shut, he placed it inside the dumpster, leaving behind everything that tethered him to his identity. "Gone," he murmured to himself, as if saying it aloud would make it true. A cab pulled up at the corner, where he'd instructed it earlier. The driver didn't bother looking at him twice when Ethan got in, his disheveled appearance blending into the shadows of the evening. "Where to?" the driver asked, his tone curt. "South Bronx, near the shelter on St. Anne's," Ethan replied. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, but didn't argue. Few people willingly went to that neighborhood, and even fewer did it at night. Ethan leaned his head against the window, the car's hum vibrating through his skull. Outside, Manhattan glittered like a monument to success. His success. But within an hour, that facade would fade. It had to. When they reached the edge of the South Bronx, the cab driver slowed the car to a stop. Ethan handed him a crumpled $20 bill, already aware that carrying his usual black card would shatter the illusion. He stepped out onto cracked pavement. The street smelled faintly of gasoline and something sourer. Graffiti covered the brick walls of abandoned buildings, and dim streetlights buzzed, their orange glow casting broken halos across the sidewalks. Ethan pulled up his hood and looked around. Groups of men leaned against buildings, eyeing him suspiciously, their voices low murmurs. A woman in a tattered coat shuffled past, muttering to herself. He swallowed hard. This was a world he'd never dared to enter before, and now it surrounded him like a suffocating blanket. "Get out of the way, man!" someone barked as a teenager on a skateboard zoomed past, nearly clipping him. Ethan stumbled back and nearly tripped over a crate on the sidewalk. He caught his breath and kept moving deeper into the neighborhood. After a few blocks, he found a public bench near the gates of a long-shuttered shelter. It had clearly been a refuge once, but now the doors were chained shut, and boarded windows told the story of abandonment. Ethan sat, his back stiff, and tried to blend in. Across the street, a group of unhoused people clustered around a fire burning in an old oil drum. The flames flickered, their orange glow dancing against darkened walls. He debated joining them, but couldn't yet summon the courage. Instead, he pulled his knees to his chest and tried to settle in. His thin clothes offered little protection against the biting chill. He glanced around nervously, as if everyone somehow knew who he really was. For the first time, Ethan realized the weight of his experiment. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was survival. There was no warm penthouse to escape to if things got too hard. No one to bail him out. The thought gnawed at him, but he shoved it away. By midnight, exhaustion overtook his nerves. He stretched out on the bench, trying to find a position that didn't make his body ache. The street noises, the occasional shout, the thrum of distant cars, the clang of metal kept jerking him awake. At one point, he saw a man approach the bench from the corner of his eye. Ethan's breath caught as the man stared down at him for several seconds before walking away. Ethan didn't sleep after that. Morning arrived in a muted grey haze, and with it, hunger. Ethan hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and his stomach gnawed at him with sharp, insistent pangs. He shuffled to a nearby gas station, where a clerk eyed him warily as he searched for the cheapest food he could find. A pack of crackers. The coins in his pocket barely covered it. "You buying or not?" the clerk snapped, as Ethan fumbled with the money. "Yeah," Ethan muttered, sliding the coins across the counter. The transaction left him feeling stripped of his dignity. For a man who'd once ordered $1,000 bottles of wine without blinking, the reality of scrounging for crackers hit him hard. Outside, he leaned against the wall, tearing open the plastic wrapper and devouring the dry crackers without care. "Hey, mister!" a voice piped up. Ethan looked down to see a small boy standing a few feet away, his skinny arms wrapped around a tattered backpack. The boy's face was dirty, his hair matted in uneven clumps. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. "You okay?" the boy asked, his voice thin but sincere. Ethan blinked. "I'm fine." Tommy dug into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled granola bar. "Here, you look hungry." "You got somewhere to go?" Tommy asked after a pause. Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not right now." Ethan's experiment had only just begun, but already he wondered if he'd underestimated how much the streets would teach him. Without another word, he followed Tommy down the sidewalk, his expensive world shrinking further with every step. Ethan followed Tommy through a maze of narrow streets and alleyways, his sneakers scuffing against cracked pavement. The boy moved with a surprising confidence, weaving through shortcuts like he knew every brick and shadow of the neighborhood. Ethan struggled to keep up, his stiff muscles protesting after the sleepless night on the bench. "Keep up, man," Tommy called over his shoulder. "It's safer if we move quick." The space had once been a parking area, but now it was filled with makeshift shelters, cardboard structures draped with tarps, sleeping bags tucked under overhangs, and even a few shopping carts loaded with bags of belongings. Ethan noticed a broken-down van parked in the corner, its shattered windows covered with duct-taped garbage bags. "This is where I stay," Tommy said, pointing at a small patch near the far wall, where a thin blanket lay spread over a layer of cardboard. Next to it was an old backpack, one strap torn and fraying. Tommy flopped down cross-legged on the blanket, as if it were the coziest couch in the world. Ethan hesitated before sitting beside him, his legs stiff. The ground beneath him felt unforgiving, a stark contrast to the plush leather chairs he'd spent years lounging in. He glanced around, absorbing the details of the lot. A handful of other unhoused people occupied spaces nearby, some staring at Ethan with suspicion, others ignoring him completely. "You've been here long?" Ethan asked quietly, trying not to break whatever trust Tommy had offered him. "Here? Nah, a couple weeks," Tommy replied, rifling through his backpack. "Before this, I was closer to the shelter on 138th, but that got shut down. Cops said it was dangerous, so everyone had to leave. He shrugged like it didn't matter, though the faint sadness in his eyes betrayed him. Ethan leaned back against the cold wall, watching the boy. "Where's your family?" He turned his face toward the wall, his voice dropping lower. "Mom and Dad died last year. Fire, some bad wiring in the building. I tried staying with a foster family for a while, but..." He trailed off, then looked back at Ethan with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't work out, so now I do my own thing. Easier that way." Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases, and held it up for Ethan to see. It was a crude drawing, done in faded crayons. A smiling family, 2 adults and a kid, stood under a bright blue sun. Above them in shaky letters, the word home was written. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long moment. "You drew that?" Tommy smiled faintly before folding the paper again and tucking it back into his backpack like a treasure. "I make drawings sometimes and sell them to people on the street. Some folks give me $1, others just tell me to get lost." He'd spent decades sitting in meetings, debating investments, profits, and growth, but he'd never once truly considered the stories behind the statistics. Tommy wasn't a number on a spreadsheet. He was a child who had seen more hardship in his short life than most people would ever understand. "Come on," Tommy said suddenly, standing up and brushing off his jeans. "I'll show you where to get free food." People of all ages, men, women, and even a few kids, waited patiently, clutching plastic bags and paper cups. Ethan stood in line with Tommy, feeling out of place but grateful for the distraction. Inside, volunteers handed out bowls of soup, bread rolls, and small cartons of milk. The smell of warm food hit Ethan like a wave. "Stick close to me," Tommy whispered as they moved forward. When it was their turn, Ethan accepted a bowl of soup and a roll from an older woman who offered him a kind smile. Her face was lined with years of care, but her eyes held warmth. "Here you go, hon," she said gently. "Stay safe out there." They don't care what you look like or where you came from. They just help. He wasn't just observing poverty anymore. He was in it, sharing meals and spaces with those who had no choice. As they finished eating, Tommy looked up at Ethan and smiled. "See? It's not so bad, huh? You'll get used to it." Cardboard boxes and wooden pallets had been pushed together to create a makeshift barrier against the wind. The smell of rot lingered faintly in the air, but Tommy seemed unfazed. "Here," Tommy said, dropping his backpack against the wall and sitting down. He grabbed a worn blanket from the pile and draped it over his shoulders. "We'll be okay here. No one bothers us." He'd been cold, hungry, and exhausted, but the hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was watching Tommy, an 8-year-old child, navigate this life with unsettling familiarity. The boy was alert to every sound and movement, his small body coiled like a spring, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Ethan wondered how long it had taken for him to learn survival instincts like that. "You do this every night?" Ethan asked softly, his voice just above a whisper. "Most nights." Tommy shrugged, like it was no big deal. "Sometimes I find a shelter that'll let me in, but they fill up fast. People say there's no space for kids, or that I need a grown-up with me." He shook his head bitterly. "Like that makes sense." He paused, looking at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "What about you? You don't look like the others I've seen. You ain't been out here long, huh?" He stared at Tommy, processing what he'd just heard. The boy's voice had been quiet but steady, with no trace of embarrassment or hesitation now. "Pretend to be your dad," Ethan repeated slowly, his voice soft. "Yeah." Tommy shifted, pulling his knees to his chest. "Just for a day, you don't have to do much, just like, I don't know, walk with me, maybe go to the park or something. We don't even got to talk that much." The request caught him off guard. A child's innocent plea cutting through the careful walls Ethan had built around himself. Tommy's words were simple, but their weight hit like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about food, shelter, or survival. It was about something much deeper, something human. "Why?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. Tommy's expression softened, and for the first time, he looked vulnerable. "Because when I see kids with their dads, They look happy. They laugh, play catch, stuff like that. I want to know what that feels like, even if it's pretend, just once. Ethan exhaled shakily, forcing himself to look back at Tommy. "Okay," he said softly, "I'll do it." For Tommy, it wasn't a game. It was a glimpse of the life he'd lost, or perhaps never had. A normal day, a day where he wasn't just surviving, but living. "Get some rest," Tommy said, flopping back onto the blanket and pulling it up to his chin. "Tomorrow's gonna be awesome." He thought about Tommy's words, about the innocence and weight behind his request. Pretend to be his dad. In that moment, Ethan realized the depth of his own ignorance. He'd thought this experiment was about survival, food, warmth, shelter. But Tommy had shown him something more. People didn't just need physical safety. They needed connection, love, and dignity. The world Ethan had lived in, where profits were everything, felt hollow now. How many Tommies had he passed on the street without seeing them? How many opportunities to help had he ignored? The thought clawed at him as he listened to the sounds of the boy's steady breathing beside him. Tomorrow, he would do everything in his power to give Tommy the day he'd asked for. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Morning came with a dull grey sky, the kind that signaled rain but held it back like a whispered threat. Ethan was already awake, his body stiff from the hard ground and the cold air that had settled deep into his bones overnight. Beside him, Tommy stirred, stretching beneath the thin blanket before sitting up with a yawn. "Morning," Tommy said, his voice groggy but cheerful. "You sleep okay?" The world had given him nothing, yet here he was, excited about a day that to most kids would have seemed ordinary. For Tommy, it was everything. "Yeah," Ethan said, pulling himself to his feet. "I'm ready." "Luke sometimes has bagels left over from Sunday service," he explained. "But the gas station trash cans have sandwiches if you get there before the rats." A few men and women were already in line, clutching paper cups of coffee. Ethan and Tommy waited their turn, and when they reached the front, a young woman with a bright smile handed them each a banana and a bagel. "Good to see you again, Tommy," she said warmly. "You keeping out of trouble?" She looked at Ethan curiously, as if trying to place him. "New around here?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Ethan replied, clearing his throat, "just trying to figure things out." He couldn't stop staring at the boy, wondering how he'd survived this life for so long. "So what's first?" Ethan asked after Tommy finished. "The park," Tommy said, his eyes lighting up. "There's one a few blocks from here. It's not fancy, but it's got swings and benches. You'll like it." Tommy greeted a few people along the way, other kids, older men hunched over on benches, like he knew everyone who lived in this forgotten corner of the city. When they reached the park, Ethan was struck by how empty it was. The playground equipment was old and rusted, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. Grass grew in uneven patches, and the benches were covered in graffiti. But to Tommy, it might as well have been Disneyland. "Come on!" Tommy ran toward the swings, kicking up dust as he went. He grabbed one of the chains and grinned back at Ethan. "Push me!" He stood up, brushing dirt off his pants, and ran toward a small patch of grass. "Let's play catch." It was strange, Ethan thought, how something so simple, a swing, a game of catch, could mean so much. For a kid like Tommy, this wasn't just play. It was proof that, for once, someone was paying attention to him. When they finally sat on one of the benches, out of breath and sweaty, Tommy pulled a small sketch pad from his bag. "You mind if I draw?" Tommy worked quietly, his tongue poking out as he concentrated. After a while, he held up the drawing for Ethan to see. It was a rough sketch of the two of them sitting on the bench, with Ethan holding the tennis ball and Tommy grinning beside him. Ethan stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. "You're really good at that," he said softly. Tommy shrugged, a little embarrassed. "It's just a picture." The distance between those two worlds felt insurmountable. And yet here he was, sitting beside a boy who had nothing, feeling more connected than he ever had in his life. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Tommy stuffed his sketch pad back into his bag and stretched. "We should head back. Gotta find a good spot for the night." Ethan listened, a quiet ache in his chest. Today had been pretend for him, but for Tommy it had been real. When they reached the loading dock, Tommy pulled out his blanket and sat down, already yawning. "You're not bad at this dad stuff," he said, smiling sleepily. "Maybe you could do it for real someday." He was already asleep, his head resting against the wall, his small frame wrapped in the tattered blanket. Ethan watched him, his heart heavy. Today had changed something in him, something he couldn't yet explain, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't pretend anymore. The following morning, Ethan woke to the sounds of the city grinding back to life. Car horns blared in the distance, and the faint hum of construction vibrated through the concrete. He sat up stiffly, his back screaming in protest from another night on the hard ground. Tommy was still asleep, curled up under his thin blanket, his face soft and peaceful for the first time since Ethan had met him. Ethan stood slowly, brushing the dirt off his jeans, and stared down at the boy. Something about Tommy's quiet, vulnerable form made Ethan pause. How many mornings like this had Tommy faced alone? How many days had he greeted with empty stomachs, cold feet, and no one to rely on? A noise snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. A group of men laughing across the alley. One of them glanced their way, his eyes narrowing with interest. Ethan's instincts flared. He'd seen this type before, even from the safety of his corporate tower. Predators looking for easy targets. "Tommy," Ethan said sharply, nudging the boy's shoulder. "Hey, wake up." 5 more minutes. Tommy didn't say a word as they navigated the maze of streets, sensing the urgency in Ethan's movements. Finally, they emerged onto a busier road, where the crowd offered a strange kind of safety. Ethan exhaled, though his heart still pounded. "You okay?" Tommy asked, glancing up at him. "Yeah." Ethan gave him a faint smile. "We'll be fine." They spent the next few hours wandering the streets. Tommy insisted on showing Ethan his favorite spot, a fountain in a small park downtown where the water still ran, even though the rest of the park had fallen into disrepair. It was quiet, hidden away from the chaos of the streets. Tommy sat cross-legged on the fountain's ledge and pulled out his sketch pad. "You don't talk much, huh?" he said as he flipped to a blank page. Ethan watched the boy thoughtfully. "I'm just thinking." He'd promised himself that he wouldn't reveal who he was, not yet. But sitting there, watching an 8-year-old boy act like this life was normal, something cracked inside him. He needed to do something. "Tommy, listen," he started slowly. "There's something I need to tell you." "What do you mean?" Ethan's voice was steady. "I'm telling you the truth. I didn't understand, Tommy. I didn't know how hard it really is, but now I do, and now I want to help. They all say they want to help, but they don't. They just leave. I don't need your help," he snapped. "I don't need anyone's help." And for the first time, he felt powerless to fix it. As the sun began to set, Ethan stayed by the fountain, waiting, hoping Tommy would come back. But the boy didn't return. Ethan stayed by the fountain long after the sun disappeared behind the city skyline. The park grew darker, the air colder, but he didn't move. He replayed the scene over and over in his head, Tommy's face shifting from curiosity to anger, the sharp sting of his words. "You lied about everything." Ethan had watched the boy disappear into the crowd, small and vulnerable, and he hadn't been able to stop him. It was supposed to be different. Ethan thought he could reveal the truth, make Tommy trust him even more. He'd been arrogant. He realized that now. You couldn't just buy trust, not out here, not from a kid who'd been let down by every adult in his life. When it became clear that Tommy wasn't coming back, Ethan stood slowly, his muscles stiff from hours of waiting. The park felt empty without the boy's laughter. He shoved his hands into his pockets and walked toward the street, the sounds of the city rushing to meet him, car engines, distant sirens, the chatter of pedestrians. It all seemed louder, harsher than before. Ethan had no plan, only a single thought repeating in his mind: find him. He started retracing their steps from earlier that day. The fountain, the playground, the church where they'd eaten breakfast. Each stop left him emptier, more frustrated. At St. Luke's community kitchen, Emily was still there, cleaning up from the evening meal service. She looked up when Ethan stepped inside, her expression cautious. "Back again?" she asked, wiping her hands on a towel. "Where's Tommy?" Ethan shifted, suddenly uncomfortable under her gaze. "Have you seen him? He comes here sometimes, right? But I care about Tommy. I'm worried about him. I just need to find him." A small group of people huddled near one of the fires, their eyes flicking toward Ethan as he entered. He scanned the lot quickly, his heart hammering. "Tommy!" he called, his voice low but urgent. No response. A man sitting on an overturned milk crate gave a dry chuckle. "Ain't no Tommy here, pal. Move along." Finally, he spotted a flash of movement in the far corner, a small figure crouched near a pile of broken pallets. "Tommy!" Ethan called again, his voice catching. The figure froze, then darted toward the back of the lot. Ethan cursed under his breath and hurried after him. "Wait!" I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. I promise you." I'm tired," he muttered, his voice small. "I'm so tired, Ethan." He could walk away, return to his life of comfort, and pretend none of this ever happened. Or he could keep his promise, not just to Tommy, but to himself. And he knew there was only one real choice. Ethan and Tommy sat quietly in the narrow alley for what felt like hours, the city's noise muffled by the tight walls pressing in on either side of them. Tommy had pulled his knees to his chest, his head resting atop his arms. His face was hidden, but his small frame radiated exhaustion, emotional and physical. Ethan leaned against the cold brick, staring into the distance, thoughts racing as he tried to untangle the mess he'd made. Finally, Tommy broke the silence. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice flat, as though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Ethan looked at him, taking in the boy's downcast posture. "We find someplace warm to sleep tonight," he said simply. "And tomorrow, we figure this out." I talked a big game, made donations to look good, but I didn't see anything. Not really. But now I do. And I won't turn my back on it. I won't turn my back on you. It wasn't an official shelter, but the pastor occasionally opened the doors for those who had nowhere else to go. A handwritten sign hung on the rusted gate. No questions, no judgment, just warmth. Tommy glanced over his shoulder at Ethan. "They let people sleep here sometimes, only if you're quiet and don't cause trouble." Blankets were spread across the cement floor, where a handful of people had already staked out their corners. An elderly man sat on an overturned crate, muttering softly to himself. A mother and her 2 children huddled in the far corner, their quiet whispers drifting through the cold air. Tommy found a spot near a wall and dropped his bag with a sigh. He pulled out his blanket and spread it across the ground, then sat down, hugging it around his shoulders. Ethan lowered himself beside him, glancing around. The space was quiet, heavy with the unspoken weariness of its occupants. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan leaned his head against the wall, staring up at the exposed pipes that snaked along the ceiling. How had things come to this? How had a kid like Tommy been forgotten by everyone, the system, the city, the people walking by? He thought about his office, the board meetings, the spreadsheets that stripped human lives down to numbers. All of it felt obscene now. "Ethan," Tommy's voice broke through the quiet. Ethan turned to him. "Yeah? What if you can't?" Ethan barely slept. The cold of the basement crept into his bones, and his mind churned with plans, fragmented ideas that danced on the edge of something bigger. He couldn't keep Tommy here, on the streets. That much was clear, but taking him somewhere better wasn't as simple as walking into a building with open arms. Kids like Tommy were invisible to the system, shuffled through the cracks no one wanted to see. Ethan would have to do more than help Tommy. He'd have to change something. A shelter, a home, a place that offered not just food and warmth, but a future. Could he do it? Could he use his wealth, his influence, to fix even a piece of this broken world? He didn't know. But for the first time in his life, the money in his bank account didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a tool. When dawn broke, pale light filtering through the basement windows, Ethan stood and stretched. Tommy was still asleep, curled up like a cat under his blanket. Ethan watched him for a moment before pulling a notebook from his pocket. He'd grabbed it when he'd left his penthouse, thinking he might need it to keep notes on his experiment. He flipped to a blank page, the pen cool in his hand, and began to write. A plan for Tommy. A plan for others. The words were simple, but they were a start. Later that morning, Tommy woke to the sound of Ethan zipping up his hoodie. The boy blinked up at him, bleary-eyed. "What are you doing?" Tommy sighed, as if the weight of hope was almost too much to carry. "Okay," he said quietly. "What do we do first?" As they stepped out into the crisp morning air, Ethan felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar combination of resolve and purpose. He'd come to the streets to understand. Now he was leaving with a mission. The real work was about to begin. The morning was crisp and cloudless, sunlight spilling onto the cracked pavement as Ethan and Tommy moved through the streets. Tommy carried his backpack slung over one shoulder, his steps quieter than usual. There was no playful energy, no chatter about favorite spots or tricks to avoid trouble. Instead, he watched Ethan closely, as if waiting for him to break another promise. Ethan felt the boy's scrutiny and didn't blame him. Trust wasn't earned in a day, and Tommy had been let down too many times to believe anything else. The weight of the moment sat heavy on Ethan's shoulders. This wasn't a business deal where failure meant a smaller profit margin. This was Tommy's life, and maybe the lives of dozens of others like him. There was no margin for failure. Ethan's first stop was a small diner on the edge of the neighborhood. Its neon sign flickered erratically, and the windows were smudged, but the smell of coffee and fried eggs carried warmly into the street. Ethan pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling softly. Tommy froze at the entrance. "We can't go in there," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "They don't let people like me sit inside. We don't do handouts here." The boy slid in hesitantly, his eyes darting around the room, as though he expected someone to throw them out at any second. Ethan sat across from him and poured himself a cup of coffee from the carafe left on the table. "Relax," Ethan said softly. "You're allowed to be here." For years, people like Tommy had been invisible to him, nothing more than part of the city's background noise. It made him sick to think about it now. The waitress returned with 2 plates, scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon, and set them down with a gruff nod. Tommy's eyes widened as he stared at the food. He hesitated for only a second before digging in, his small hands working quickly as though someone might take the plate away if he didn't eat fast enough. Ethan watched him, his own appetite dulled by the sight. "Slow down," he said gently. "It's not going anywhere." "I want to tell you about what I'm thinking," he said. Tommy glanced up warily. "About helping?" Tommy shook his head, looking down at his plate. "Sounds like a nice dream, but dreams don't come true out here." He couldn't waste time. This plan needed to move, and fast. "Where are we going now?" Tommy asked as they walked, his voice quieter than usual. "To see someone who can help." They reached a payphone on the corner of a busy street, and Ethan dug a few coins from his pocket. He dialed Marcus's number, praying he'd pick up. The line clicked. "Marcus Taylor," came the familiar voice, crisp and efficient. "Marcus," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's me." The place was empty except for a tired barista wiping down the counter. Ethan pushed open the door, motioning for Tommy to follow. "Is this place fancy?" Tommy asked, squinting at the faded menu overhead. "Not even close," Ethan replied, scanning the room for Marcus. He spotted him almost immediately, a tall figure in a perfectly pressed suit sitting in the back corner, a laptop open in front of him and a cup of black coffee untouched. Marcus's sharp gaze met Ethan's, narrowing slightly as he took in his disheveled appearance. "This your friend?" Tommy whispered, sticking close to Ethan's side. "Yeah, don't worry." Ethan put a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and led him to the table. Marcus stood as they approached, closing his laptop with a crisp snap. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and controlled, "you look awful." His eyes darted to Tommy, widening slightly before returning to Ethan. "What's going on? Who's the kid?" "Really, listen. And I've seen—" He glanced at Tommy, who was staring at the table, trying to look like he wasn't listening. "I've seen this kid survive things no one should have to." This is bigger than shareholders and profit margins. This is about doing something that matters," Marcus asked quietly. Ethan glanced at Tommy, then back at Marcus. "I take care of him. First, I get him off the streets. Then I make sure he never has to go back. You're lucky I've been dealing with your messes for years." Ethan stood at the window of a high-rise conference room, his reflection blending with the sweeping view of Manhattan below. The skyscrapers were shining monuments to wealth, but now they felt different, soulless, towering reminders of the world he'd spent his life building, a world that ignored people like Tommy. Behind him, the hum of anxious voices filled the room. The board of Walker Enterprises, a dozen men and women in tailored suits, were seated at a long mahogany table, glaring at him. At the head sat Alan Grayson, the board chairman, his silver hair perfectly combed, his jaw tight with restrained irritation. Marcus stood off to the side, a tablet in hand, his face impassive. He'd warned Ethan about this meeting. "They'll fight you on this, Ethan. Be ready." And now, here they were, staring him down like wolves circling their prey. "Ethan," Alan said finally, breaking the tense silence, "we've humored your absence long enough. You've vanished for weeks, leaving the company in chaos, and now you show up with this?" He waved a copy of Ethan's written proposal, Project Horizon, a community rebuilding initiative, as if it were an insult. Ethan turned, his voice calm but firm. "It's not this. It's a solution, a way for us to invest in the people who've been forgotten." Walker Enterprises isn't a charity. It's a business. Your proposal would divert millions of dollars from lucrative projects into something that doesn't generate returns. It's reckless." "I won't do it anymore." Alan asked quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "If that's what it takes." "Fine," he said finally. "If you want to throw your money into the fire, that's your choice, but you won't use company resources for this. The board won't support it." "They'll come around," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll just change their minds?" He turned to face Marcus, his expression unshakable. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Tommy shot him a skeptical look. "Doesn't look like much." "You're really doing this?" As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the warehouse, Ethan stood with Tommy at his side, both of them staring at the building. The road ahead would be hard, he knew that, but this was the beginning. A promise was only as strong as the actions behind it, and Ethan Walker was ready to fight for every inch, for Tommy, for the invisible, for something real. Months passed like a blur of progress and setbacks, but every moment was marked by purpose. The abandoned warehouse that had once stood as a symbol of decay transformed day by day into something new. Contractors worked tirelessly to clear out the rot, rebuilding walls and installing windows that let the light pour in. Volunteers arrived to help paint rooms, lay tiles and assemble furniture. Ethan was in the middle of it all, no longer the man behind a desk, but a leader with sleeves rolled up and sweat staining his shirt. Tommy watched it all with quiet disbelief. At first, he refused to believe it was real. "It's gonna stop," he would mutter when no one was listening, his voice a shield against disappointment. But it never stopped. The sounds of saws, hammers, and voices echoed through the halls every day, building something bigger than either of them had imagined. By winter, Project Horizon was complete. The grand opening was quiet. Not a ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras and headlines, but something far better. Ethan stood in front of the rebuilt warehouse alongside Tommy, who had refused to wear the new clothes Ethan had bought him. Instead, the boy stood with his backpack slung over his shoulder, the same scrappy kid he'd always been, though his eyes were brighter now. The building was unrecognizable. Once broken and hollow, it was now alive. A clean facade of brick and glass gleamed in the pale sunlight, with a sign above the front doors that read, "Horizon House, a place to begin." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Everyone deserves a second chance. Tommy led him to a side hallway where a large white wall had been reserved for one special edition. On it, in bright crayon strokes, was a mural Tommy had spent weeks creating. Ethan stopped, stunned, as he took in the details. The centerpiece of the drawing was a family, a father and a son, sitting on a bench in a park. Above them, in large, uneven letters, Tommy had written a single word: home. "You did this?" Ethan asked softly, his voice catching. Tommy nodded, his expression serious. "You said this place should feel like home for people, so I drew what home feels like to me." So I guess you're kind of like..." He trailed off, looking away. "You know, families moved in, kids enrolled in local schools, and parents found work through the job training programs Ethan had funded. Community kitchens provided warm meals, and classrooms offered opportunities for people to learn skills they'd never thought possible." One evening, Marcus stood beside Ethan on the balcony of Horizon House, watching as kids played soccer in the yard below. Tommy was among them, laughing and shouting as he kicked the ball across the grass. Marcus shook his head, smiling faintly. "You did it. I didn't think you would, but you did." Tommy leaned against his side, just for a moment, as though testing the comfort of trust. Ethan didn't move, letting the boy rest. "Good night, Ethan," Tommy said softly, his voice already sleepy. Ethan smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good night, kid." "Then we'll change that," Ethan said simply. Tommy shook his head, looking down at his plate. "Sounds like a nice dream, but dreams don't come true out here." When they left the diner, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't waste time. This plan needed to move, and fast. "Where are we going now?" Tommy asked as they walked, his voice quieter than usual. "To see someone who can help." If there was anyone who could help him begin this impossible task, it was him. They reached a payphone on the corner of a busy street, and Ethan dug a few coins from his pocket. He dialed Marcus's number, praying he'd pick up. The line clicked. "Marcus Taylor," came the familiar voice, crisp and efficient. "Marcus," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's me." The place was empty except for a tired barista wiping down the counter. Ethan pushed open the door, motioning for Tommy to follow. "Is this place fancy?" Tommy asked, squinting at the faded menu overhead. "Not even close," Ethan replied, scanning the room for Marcus. He spotted him almost immediately, a tall figure in a perfectly pressed suit sitting in the back corner, a laptop open in front of him and a cup of black coffee untouched. Marcus's sharp gaze met Ethan's, narrowing slightly as he took in his disheveled appearance. "This your friend?" Tommy whispered, sticking close to Ethan's side. "Yeah, don't worry." Ethan put a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder and led him to the table. Marcus stood as they approached, closing his laptop with a crisp snap. "Ethan," he said, his voice low and controlled, "you look awful." His eyes darted to Tommy, widening slightly before returning to Ethan. "What's going on? Who's the kid? Really, listen. And I've seen..." He glanced at Tommy, who was staring at the table, trying to look like he wasn't listening. "I've seen this kid survive things no one should have to. This is bigger than shareholders and profit margins. This is about doing something that matters," Marcus asked quietly. Ethan glanced at Tommy, then back at Marcus. "I take care of him. First, I get him off the streets. Then I make sure he never has to go back. You're lucky I've been dealing with your messes for years." Ethan stood at the window of a high-rise conference room, his reflection blending with the sweeping view of Manhattan below. The skyscrapers were shining monuments to wealth, but now they felt different, soulless, towering reminders of the world he'd spent his life building. A world that ignored people like Tommy. Behind him, the hum of anxious voices filled the room. The board of Walker Enterprises, a dozen men and women in tailored suits, were seated at a long mahogany table, glaring at him. At the head sat Alan Grayson, the board chairman, his silver hair perfectly combed, his jaw tight with restrained irritation. Marcus stood off to the side, a tablet in hand, his face impassive. He'd warned Ethan about this meeting. They'll fight you on this, Ethan. Be ready." And now, here they were, staring him down like wolves circling their prey. "Ethan," Alan said finally, breaking the tense silence, "we've humored your absence long enough. You've vanished for weeks, leaving the company in chaos, and now you show up with this?" He waved a copy of Ethan's written proposal, Project Horizon, a community rebuilding initiative, as if it were an insult. Ethan turned, his voice calm but firm. "It's not this. It's a solution, a way for us to invest in the people who've been forgotten." Walker Enterprises isn't a charity, it's a business. Your proposal would divert millions of dollars from lucrative projects into something that doesn't generate returns. It's reckless. I won't do it anymore." Alan asked quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "If that's what it takes." "Fine," he said finally. "If you want to throw your money into the fire, that's your choice, but you won't use company resources for this. The board won't support it." "They'll come around," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think they'll just change their minds?" He turned to face Marcus, his expression unshakable. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Tommy shot him a skeptical look. "Doesn't look like much." "You're really doing this?" As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the warehouse, Ethan stood with Tommy at his side, both of them staring at the building. The road ahead would be hard, he knew that, but this was the beginning. A promise was only as strong as the actions behind it, and Ethan Walker was ready to fight for every inch, for Tommy, for the invisible, for something real. Months passed like a blur of progress and setbacks, but every moment was marked by purpose. The abandoned warehouse that had once stood as a symbol of decay transformed day by day into something new. Contractors worked tirelessly to clear out the rot, rebuilding walls and installing windows that let the light pour in. Volunteers arrived to help paint rooms, lay tiles and assemble furniture. Ethan was in the middle of it all, no longer the man behind a desk, but a leader with sleeves rolled up and sweat staining his shirt. Tommy watched it all with quiet disbelief. At first, he refused to believe it was real. "It's gonna stop," he would mutter when no one was listening, his voice a shield against disappointment. But it never stopped. The sounds of saws, hammers, and voices echoed through the halls every day, building something bigger than either of them had imagined. By winter, Project Horizon was complete. The grand opening was quiet. Not a ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras and headlines, but something far better. Ethan stood in front of the rebuilt warehouse alongside Tommy, who had refused to wear the new clothes Ethan had bought him. Instead, the boy stood with his backpack slung over his shoulder, the same scrappy kid he'd always been, though his eyes were brighter now. The building was unrecognizable. Once broken and hollow, it was now alive. A clean facade of brick and glass gleamed in the pale sunlight, with a sign above the front doors that read, "Horizon House, a place to begin." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Everyone deserves a second chance. Tommy led him to a side hallway where a large white wall had been reserved for one special edition. On it, in bright crayon strokes, was a mural Tommy had spent weeks creating. Ethan stopped, stunned, as he took in the details. The centerpiece of the drawing was a family, a father and a son, sitting on a bench in a park. Above them, in large, uneven letters, Tommy had written a single word, "Home." "You did this?" Ethan asked softly, his voice catching. Tommy nodded, his expression serious. "You said this place should feel like home for people, so I drew what home feels like to me." So I guess you're kind of like..." He trailed off, looking away. "You know, families moved in, kids enrolled in local schools, and parents found work through the job training programs Ethan had funded. Community kitchens provided warm meals, and classrooms offered opportunities for people to learn skills they'd never thought possible. One evening, Marcus stood beside Ethan on the balcony of Horizon House, watching as kids played soccer in the yard below. Tommy was among them, laughing and shouting as he kicked the ball across the grass. Marcus shook his head, smiling faintly. You did it. I didn't think you would, but you did. Tommy leaned against his side, just for a moment as though testing the comfort of trust. Ethan didn't move, letting the boy rest. "Good night, Ethan," Tommy said softly, his voice already sleepy. Ethan smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good night, kid."